The grand lobby of Heritage Bank was a cathedral of wealth and power. Its marble floors gleamed under the soft glow of golden chandeliers, and the air carried the faint scent of polished wood and fresh paper. Behind the glass partitions, employees bustled, their crisp suits blending into the monotonous hum of productivity. Customers came and went, most of them hurried professionals, their footsteps clicking against the tiles as they rushed to finalize transactions before the lunch hour ended. Amidst this orchestrated rhythm of finance, a tall, broad-shouldered man sat alone in the waiting area, his oversized winter coat draped over his lap. His presence was impossible to ignore, yet no one paid him much attention, except for the occasional side glance from a passing banker or the skeptical look from the receptionist. His sneakers, though pristine, stood out awkwardly against the sea of polished leather shoes. His gold chain gleamed under the fluorescent lights, catching a few judgmental stares. But the man remained still, his fingers tapping absently against the armrest of his chair, his gaze steady on the large clock hanging over the reception desk. 1 hour and 45 minutes. His patience was not infinite. Across the room, behind an imposing mahogany desk, the bank manager, Richard Caldwell, barely spared him a glance. Richard was a man who carried himself with the self-importance of someone who had worked his way up the corporate ladder. He wore arrogance like a second skin, adjusting his tie every few minutes as though to reaffirm his authority. He was in the middle of an animated conversation with an older client, his voice dripping with exaggerated charm. The contrast was glaring. While Richard attended to affluent customers with unyielding enthusiasm, the man in the waiting area, despite his unmistakable presence, had been left to simmer in silence. The receptionist, a young woman with wary eyes, had approached Richard twice. "Sir, the gentleman over there. He says he has an appointment." Richard had barely looked up from his paperwork. "Tell him to wait. I do not take walk-ins during peak hours." "But sir, he says a lot of things." Richard cut in dismissively. "He can wait. If it is that urgent, he should have scheduled through the proper channels." And so, the man waited. For 2 hours. The whispers began long ago. The security guard near the entrance had exchanged a knowing look with one of the tellers. A few employees had muttered under their breath, their eyes flickering toward the waiting figure before quickly looking away. The longer he sat there, the more the tension thickened in the air, not from his demeanor, which remained calm and composed, but from the unspoken assumptions swirling around him, because to them, he did not belong. Richard, now finally free of his esteemed client, stretched his shoulders and checked his watch. He sighed as he saw the receptionist hovering yet again. "What is it now?" She hesitated, glancing at the man in the waiting area. "Sir, he insists that you see him immediately." Richard scoffed. "Insists?" His lips curled in amusement. "Fine. Let us see what is so important." He smoothed down his suit, exuding the casual superiority of a man certain of his place in the world. With a final glance at his reflection in the glass of his office window, he strode across the lobby and stopped just short of the seated man. "You have been waiting a while," Richard said, his voice carrying the thinly veiled condescension of someone addressing an uninvited guest. "I suppose you must think your business is urgent." The man finally stood, unfolding himself to his full height. His expression remained unreadable, but there was something in his eyes, something quiet, something measured. "I am Michael," he said simply, "but you can call me Shaq." Richard raised an eyebrow, barely masking his disinterest. "Right. And how can Heritage Bank help you today, Mr. Shaq?" For the first time in 2 hours, a slow smile stretched across Michael's face. It was not a friendly smile, not an aggressive one either. Just the kind of smile that hinted at a secret only one person in the room knew. "You can start by showing me to my office," he said. Silence. Richard blinked, the words taking a moment to register. "Excuse me?" Michael reached into his coat pocket, pulling out a neatly folded letter with the official Heritage Bank insignia stamped at the top. He handed it to Richard, who took it with a bemused smirk. until his eyes landed on the words printed in bold at the top. Dear Mr. Michael Big Shaq Lawrence, we are pleased to welcome you as the new CEO of Heritage Bank. The blood drained from Richard's face. The receptionist's breath hitched. The security guard straightened, as though suddenly aware of a shift in the air. And then, before Richard could open his mouth, before he could stammer an apology, an excuse, anything, Michael tilted his head ever so slightly and asked, in the same calm, measured tone he had used all along, "Would you like to try that introduction again?" Michael Lawrence, better known to the world as Big Shaq, had never been the kind of man who sought attention. He had grown up in the heart of South London, where opportunities were scarce, and survival meant understanding how to navigate both the streets and the system. His mother, a woman of quiet strength, had worked 3 jobs to put food on the table, and she had drilled into him a lesson he carried to this day. Respect is earned, not demanded, but when it is denied where it is due, you do not argue. You show them who you are. Those words rang in his mind as he watched Richard Caldwell's face shift through a spectrum of emotions, amusement, confusion, then horror, as he processed the truth. The man he had so callously ignored for 2 hours was not a mere visitor, not some desperate businessman seeking a loan. He was the Michael Lawrence, the new CEO. Michael let the silence stretch. The weight of it settled over the room, thick and unyielding. Every eye in the lobby was on them now. Tellers, clients, even the security guard near the entrance had turned to watch. The receptionist, who had tried to advocate for him earlier, shifted uncomfortably behind her desk, avoiding Richard's gaze. She had known something was off. She had tried to warn him. Richard, still gripping the letter as if it might disintegrate in his hands, cleared his throat. I was not informed of this appointment," he stammered. "If I had known—" Michael held up a hand, stopping him mid-sentence. "It is not about whether you knew or not. It is about how you acted when you thought I was nobody." The silence deepened. A slow burn of embarrassment crept up Richard's neck, turning his ears red. He straightened his tie, the last vestige of his authority. But it no longer seemed to fit the moment. Michael let the words settle before stepping past him. "Now, if you will excuse me, I have an office to see." He did not look back. He did not need to. The hushed whispers followed him as he walked toward the executive wing. As Michael entered the corridor leading to his new office, his mind drifted back to a different kind of room. One filled with the scent of aftershave, the hum of clippers, and the laughter of men who carried the weight of the world, but found solace in a simple trim. He had worked in his uncle's barbershop as a teenager, sweeping hair and listening, really listening. The barbershop had been more than a place for haircuts. It had been a forum, a confessional, a classroom. It was where men debated politics, vented about work, laughed about life, and shared wisdom with those willing to hear. "Mike," his uncle had once said, spinning the chair to face him, "people show you who they are when they think you can do nothing for them." He had learned more about power and respect in that tiny shop than any business school could teach, and today that lesson had played out in real time. Richard followed a few steps behind him, shoulders stiff. The weight of his mistake hung in the air. "You should have received a memo about my arrival," Michael said without turning around. "Did you not check?" Richard swallowed hard. "It must have been a mix-up. I will review it now." Michael chuckled under his breath. "Do that." The receptionist from earlier appeared at his side, her steps hesitant. "Mr. Lawrence, would you like me to show you to your office?" Michael turned to her, finally giving her the attention she deserved. "What is your name?" "Lisa, sir." "Lisa, you were the only person who showed an ounce of professionalism today." He glanced at Richard, who shifted uncomfortably. "Maybe you should be the one managing this place." Lisa's eyes widened slightly, a mix of surprise and nervousness in them. Richard opened his mouth as if to protest, but thought better of, and Michael nodded toward her. "Lead the way." Lisa stepped ahead, her posture more confident now, and Michael followed. As they moved deeper into the executive wing, the setting changed. The marble floors remained, but the air felt different, colder, more exclusive. Large, glass-walled offices lined the corridor, each one occupied by sharply dressed professionals who barely acknowledged their presence. Michael caught the subtle shifts. The way people whispered as they passed. The way eyes flickered toward Richard, silently asking, "What happened?" The irony was not lost on him. He had spent 2 hours invisible to these people. Now he was a walking earthquake, shaking the very foundation they had built their comfort on. Lisa stopped at a set of double doors with a polished brass nameplate. Michael Lawrence, CEO. The name was freshly engraved. He reached for the handle but paused. There was something almost surreal about this moment. The boy who once swept floors in a barber shop was now standing at the threshold of a multi-million-dollar institution, the leader of an empire built by the same people who would have overlooked him a day ago. But his moment of reflection was interrupted by a voice. "Mr. Lawrence." Michael turned to see a man in his late 50s approaching. His tailored suit, graying temples and measured steps, spoke of experience, authority. Lisa stepped back, whispering, "That is Mr. Whitmore, chairman of the board." Michael nodded slightly. "Mr. Whitmore." The older man extended a hand. "Welcome to Heritage Bank." His grip was firm, his eyes sharp. "I hope your first day has been enlightening." Michael studied him for a beat. There was something behind those words, something layered. "A test, perhaps?" "Oh, it has been," Michael said smoothly. "More than you know." Whitmore's lips curled into something that was not quite a smile. Michael recognized that look. It was the look of a man who knew exactly what kind of battlefield he had just walked into. And so did Michael. Michael stood in his new office, taking in the view from the top floor. The city stretched before him, a sea of movement and ambition. From up here, everything looked small. Yet he knew that the real battles were fought in places where the view was obstructed, where closed doors and whispered conversations decided the fate of men who never saw them coming. His office was a testament to corporate grandeur, floor-to-ceiling windows, sleek modern furniture, and an oak desk that looked like it had been stolen from a king's study. Yet, for all its luxury, it did not feel like his yet. Not entirely. Behind him, Richard Caldwell lingered at the door like a shadow refusing to disappear. "If there is anything you need, Mr. Lawrence, I am at your disposal," Richard said, his tone carefully measured. Michael turned slowly, watching the man who had just made him wait 2 hours without a second thought. Richard's demeanor had shifted, not quite apologetic but cautious, like a snake that had been caught coiling too soon. "You seem tense, Richard," Michael said, taking a seat. "Is there a reason for that?" Richard forced a tight smile. "Not at all. Just adjusting to the change, I suppose." Michael leaned forward, resting his elbows on the desk. "Change is inevitable. The real question is whether you adapt or get left behind." Richard's eyes flickered. It was a brief moment, but Michael caught it. A tell. The game had begun. The rest of the day was a test of endurance. Meetings, introductions, polite formalities that were anything but. The executive team welcomed him with smiles that never quite reached their eyes. Every handshake came with an unspoken challenge, every glance a measure of where he stood. It was clear they had expected someone different, someone who fit the mold. Whitmore, the chairman, remained unreadable. He watched Michael carefully, not with hostility, but with the weight of a man who knew the boardroom was just another battlefield. Richard, on the other hand, wasted no time establishing the first of many obstacles. At 2 p.m., Michael's assistant, a young woman named Evelyn, knocked hesitantly on his door. "Mr. Lawrence," she said, glancing at her tablet. "There seems to be a scheduling conflict. The executive board meeting was set for 3 o'clock, but Mr. Caldwell has moved it to noon." Michael raised an eyebrow. "Noon?" "Yes, sir." She hesitated. "It started an hour ago." Michael's fingers drummed lightly against the desk at a power move, a subtle way to make him look unprepared and competent, like he had no control over his own schedule. "Richard made that call?" She nodded. He said he thought it would be best to get started without delay. Michael exhaled. Slowly. He had expected resistance, but this was blatant. Thank you, Evelyn, he said. Where are they meeting? The main boardroom, sir. Michael stood, buttoning his jacket. Let us not keep them waiting, then. When Michael pushed open the heavy double doors of the boardroom, all conversation ceased. A dozen eyes turned. To him, some startled, others indifferent. At the head of the table, Richard sat comfortably in a chair that was not his to occupy. Ah, Michael, Richard said smoothly, as if his presence were an afterthought. We did not want to start without you, but given your absence. You mean the meeting you rescheduled without informing me? Richard's smirk faltered, but only slightly. There must have been a miscommunication. Michael stepped further into the room, letting the silence stretch. He did not move quickly, did not rush. He let the tension settle, let them feel the weight of what had just happened. And then, deliberately, he walked to the head of the table. Richard made no move to vacate the seat. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Michael did not ask him to move. He simply looked at him. A test of will. The room was silent. Even the air seemed to still. Finally, Richard gave a forced chuckle as if the moment had been a joke all along. He pushed back his chair, standing. Of course, he murmured. My mistake. Michael sat down. Richard returned to his seat, his smile thin. And just like that, the balance of power shifted. Later that evening, Michael sat in his office, the city lights flickering beyond the glass. The day had been exhausting, not just the politics, but the weight of expectation. He leaned back, closing his eyes. A memory surfaced. He was 16 again, standing outside a courtroom, his mother gripping his shoulders tightly. His older brother, Darren, had been inside, facing charges that would change his life forever. His mother had looked him in the eyes and said, Do you know why I push you so hard, Mike? Because you do not have the luxury of failing. That moment had shaped him. He had worked harder than anyone, built his success from the ground up, refused to let his past define him. And now, here he was, a CEO, not by chance, by design. He opened his eyes. Richard Caldwell thought he was playing a game. Michael was about to show him that he had been playing his whole life. The next morning, Michael arrived early. He needed to set the tone. As he walked through the lobby, he noticed something. A woman stood near the entrance watching him. She was tall, impeccably dressed, with sharp eyes that did not miss a thing. When he reached the elevators, she stepped forward. Mr. Lawrence, she said smoothly. A moment of your time? Michael studied her. And you are? She extended a card. Veronica West, Internal Affairs. Michael took the card, turning it between his fingers. What can I do for you, Ms. West? She smiled, but it did not quite reach her eyes. I believe we have something to discuss. And, just like that, Michael knew. The real war was about to begin. The following days dragged on like a slow-moving storm, with the sky growing darker by the hour. Michael had expected challenges in his new role, but nothing had prepared him for the relentless barrage of microaggressions that Richard Caldwell and others in the executive team wielded like weapons. Every board meeting was a gauntlet, a test of willpower and patience. Richard in particular seemed to take pleasure in finding ways to undermine Michael, always with a thin smile and a veiled insult disguised as a comment on the state of the company. Michael had learned quickly to keep his temper in check, but even the most composed of men had their breaking points. By the end of the week, he could feel the weight of it all pressing on him, the constant surveillance, the subtle belittling, and the sense that every move he made was being scrutinized by people who had already decided he didn't belong. One late afternoon, Michael sat at his desk, reviewing financial reports, but the numbers blurred on the page. His mind kept drifting back to the earlier incident when Richard had publicly corrected his decision on an important acquisition in front of the entire executive team. The words were calm, but the implication was clear. Michael had made a mistake, one that needed to be corrected by someone with experience. The sting of it lingered in his chest, and for a brief moment, he considered calling his mother. Her voice, filled with unwavering confidence, was always a comfort, but even she could only offer so much from a distance. A sharp knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. Michael looked up to see Evelyn standing in the doorway, her expression tense. "Mr. Lawrence," she began hesitantly, "there's a problem. Mr. Caldwell just moved up the shareholder meeting to tomorrow morning. It's a last-minute change, and he's asking for your attendance." Michael's stomach dropped. He had been expecting this, Richard's latest attempt to discredit him, but the suddenness of it took him by surprise. A meeting this important, with shareholders already on edge after the recent shakeups at the bank, would be a high-stakes battle for power. "Is it related to the financial report?" Michael asked, trying to keep his voice steady. "Yes, sir," Evelyn replied, her eyes flicking nervously. "And there's more. Richard requested that you give a presentation on the direction you plan to take the company. He said it would give the board confidence in your leadership." Michael stood, the weight of her words sinking in. "So he wants me to publicly declare my strategy while he's already undermining my decisions. Got it." He paused, his eyes narrowing. "Thank you, Evelyn. I'll be ready." As Evelyn left, Michael paced the room. The walls of his office seemed to close in around him. Every corner of the room felt like it was mocking him. The polished wood, the sleek glass, the luxury that was supposed to represent his success. But none of it felt like victory. It felt like a gilded cage. The next morning, Michael entered the boardroom with the same stoic resolve he had worn for days, but his stomach churned. The room was filled with the familiar faces of the executive team, all of them with unreadable expressions. Richard, of course, was seated at the head of the table, his usual smug smile in place. But today, there was something else in his eyes, a quiet, almost predatory glint that sent a shiver down Michael's spine. "Mr. Lawrence," Richard said, his voice dripping with condescension, "we've all been eagerly awaiting your presentation. Shall we get started?" The room fell silent as Michael stepped forward, his mind racing. He had spent hours preparing for this moment, but the air was thick with anticipation. Every person in the room was waiting for him to stumble, waiting for him to show weakness. He could feel their eyes on him, like vultures circling above. He opened his folder, hands steady, and began to speak, outlining his vision for the company, his plans for innovation, and his strategy for restoring shareholder confidence. But even as he spoke, he could see the subtle smirks on the faces of Richard and a few others in the room. It was as if they were daring him to fail, waiting for him to falter in front of them. And then, in the middle of his presentation, Richard interrupted. "I'm sorry, Michael, but I must point out something here," he said, leaning forward with a feigned look of concern. "The strategy you're proposing is admirable, but the execution seems impractical, given the current financial state of the company. Perhaps it's best if someone with more experience." He trailed off, letting the implication hang in the air. Michael's heart pounded in his chest. He had anticipated Richard's attack, but the sting was no less sharp. He could feel the eyes of the board on him, and for a split second the words failed him. His mind raced, his vision narrowing as the pressure mounted. Was this it? Was this the moment he would break under the weight of their expectations? But then, a quiet voice in the back of his mind reminded him of his mother's words. "You do not have the luxury of failing." Michael steadied his breath, his hands clasping the edges of the table. "Thank you for your input, Richard," he said calmly, keeping his tone measured. "However, I stand by my vision. The path forward requires bold moves, not caution. If we continue to play it safe, we risk losing our competitive edge, and that, gentleman, is the true threat to this company." For a brief moment, the room was silent. The board members exchanged glances, and even Richard seemed momentarily taken aback by the firmness in Michael's voice. But the tension was far from over. As Michael finished his presentation, he could feel Richard's gaze on him, the quiet animosity simmering just beneath the surface. The moment he had hoped would cement his leadership felt like nothing more than a battlefield. But the worst was yet to come. After the meeting, as the board members filed out, Richard lingered behind, his expression cold and unreadable. "You did well," he said, though the words were laced with sarcasm. "For now." Michael nodded, keeping his face impassive. "Thank you, Richard. I'll take that as a compliment." Richard leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "But make no mistake, Michael. You may have won this round, but I don't lose. Watch your back." As Richard walked away, Michael felt the weight of those words settle in his chest. The war was far from over, and he knew that Richard's next move would be even more calculated, more ruthless. He had shown a glimmer of strength, but in the eyes of the executive team, it was just a fleeting victory. Hours later, as Michael sat alone in his office, he received a call from Evelyn. Her voice was urgent, barely holding back panic. "Mr. Lawrence, you need to see this. It's about the shareholder meeting." He sat up straight, his pulse quickening. "What is it?" "There's a leak," she said, her voice trembling. "Someone's spreading rumors, accusations about your leadership. It's going viral." The words hit him like a punch to the gut. His carefully crafted image, his plan for redemption, was crumbling faster than he could keep up with. And in that moment, Michael realized this was only the beginning. The battle he had been preparing for had just taken a darker turn, and he had no idea how much farther Richard would go to see him fail. With a sharp intake of breath, Michael stood, his mind spinning. He had to act quickly. There was no time to lose. But before he could make his next move, the door to his office slammed open, and a familiar figure stepped inside. Veronica West, her face as cold as ever. "Mr. Lawrence," she said flatly, her voice carrying the weight of an unseen truth. "There's something you need to know."